I'd take some time before we get started with class just to go over the remaining schedule. All right, we only have like a week and a half left of classes. So next week and then 2 classes that final week. All right, now I did put to be determined on that last Monday. We will have class that day. All right, it's probably going to be a bunch of spillover from whatever we did not finish. All right, but there will be class, so plan on attending class that day. And then we will have our review session on that Wednesday. All right, so after that Wednesday, classes are done. And just take note that that final exam time is different from when we normally meet. All right, so our final exam is December 18th from 3:30 to 5:20. Do you have a question?
Can you zoom in on that?
I definitely can, yes. All right. So week and a half left of classes. Exam time, we got the Saturday exam slot pretty late in the afternoon, so that's awesome. We'll go on through and challenge that time slot, make sure we get good grades. But next Monday you have that assignment due, and then we have one more quiz. All right, so not too much left in the semester. Any questions about the remaining schedule? Yeah.
What did you say about that Monday? Are we still meeting?
Yes, plan on attending class on that Monday. Yep.
Okay.
All right. There's something I was going to say, and I totally forgot. It will come to me.
I have a question on the assignment.
Yes.
On, I think it's the first page. Do we use the given t-value, or do we use the one that we calculated from the question before that?
I'll have to get back to you because I can't remember what question that is at the top of my head. I will get back to you on that. All right. Alrighty, so we're going to continue on with our ecology unit here and talk about speciation. All right, before we get too far, again, we have that assignment for next Monday. I'd also like to talk about phylogenies today, but I highly doubt we're going to have time to. All right, so if we don't talk about phylogenies today, I am going to record it and put it up over the weekend as soon as I possibly can, and I expect you to watch that. I can email it when it's up. Yes, definitely. It should be quite short. All right, I just wanted to have some introduction to phylogenies, and we'll do a quick practice problem on Monday. All right, so when we're talking about the identification of species, there's some terminology that you might hear associated with it. One is microevolution. Right, so that's evolution on a very small scale. So that might be the evolution of a wolf into a domesticated dog species. We also have macroevolution. All right, this is where we're talking big picture here. So creating new species and groups of species. So maybe we started with this single-celled organism and ended up to Homo sapiens where we are today. All right, that is macroevolution. And we keep talking about species, all right, just to give a definition to that term, a group of organisms that share a distinctive set of attributes in nature. All right, and we're going to define that definition a little bit further today because we're going to talk about speciation, all right, the formation of a new species. All right, and this occurs through macro and microevolution. All right, they work together here. All right, so there's a lot of species on Earth. All right, about 1.8 million species have been identified, right? But it's estimated to think that there's up to 50 million species out there, right? Especially when we're talking about those smaller organisms like bacteria or archaea, right? It's hard to detect these smaller organisms. So a lot of those we just haven't described yet. Let's see, we have difficulty in describing what exactly is a species, all right? So beyond just a species, we can have subspecies, which are species that display traits that are different, but not different enough to make them a new species. Right? So that would be a subspecies. And we have ecotypes. So ecotypes, again, they're not a new species, but they're different. All right? They're genetically distinct based upon the environment that they are inhabiting. Right? Many bacterial species are divided into ecotypes. Right? So 2 different populations might have 2 different genetics associated with them, but they're the same species. They're different ecotypes. All right, so distinguishing a species is not as straightforward as it might seem. All right, so generally speaking, we could say sexually reproducing species are members of one species can't interbreed with another species. All right, so we can use if they can interbreed to determine if they're a species or not. All right, but it's not quite that simple. All right, sometimes it's actually hard to try to detect, can they interbreed? Are they just not interbreeding with each other, but they have the ability to? All right, it's not as straightforward. So depending on the organism we want to identify as a new species is going to determine what traits we're actually going to look at. All right, and there's many commonly used traits that we're going to go through here. But if we look at, say, this bacterial species, all right, we can see that all these different species, they look fairly similar to one another. All right, so to identify different species of bacteria, say from different species of birds or butterflies, we might employ a totally different characteristic to use to describe it as a new species. All right, so we're going to go through these traits. All right, so the first one is morphological traits. I think this one's the pretty straightforward to understand. It's the physical characteristics of an organism. Right? If organisms have the same features, if they look the same, they're likely the same species. Right? It seems straightforward, right? But there's a lot of drawbacks. Right? So if we look at two different species of frog, for example, how many traits do we consider? Right? Is just differing in coloring of skin enough to identify them as different species? Or do they also have to differ in another characteristic as well? Right? So how many traits make them different? Traits might vary. All right? So say if we used weight. Weight is a continuous value. Right? So I can't just look at a frog and go, oh, that frog is, 2.1 grams. I know it's this specific species. All right? It's not so straightforward. 2.1 grams. A lot of frogs can be 2.1 grams. So when we have traits that vary over this broad scale, it's hard to use those. And then what degree of dissimilarity do we use? All right, so if we were looking at a blue frog and another frog was just slightly more blue, all right, is that enough of a dissimilarity to say it's a different species? All right, it's hard to tell sometimes. So if we look at this image to the right here, all right, how many different frog species do you see? Shout out some numbers here. 3. See 3? 2? Different species? 4? Okay. It's actually 2 different species. All right, so it's not straightforward. These are actually the same species of a poison dart frog, and these are the same species, even though they have slight differences to them. All right, so members of the same species might look very different from one another, right? So that's another drawback of looking at just at these morphological traits. They can also look very similar to each other, and they might be different species, right? Excuse me, I said that wrong. There's actually 3 species in here, isn't there? These 2 are a species. These 2 are different species. All right, so those of you that said 3 were correct. But I'm guessing you probably said 3 because these look very different from one another. All right, another way we can define a species, and I think this is the most common way that we generally see species being defined, is through reproductive isolation. All right, something that prevents one species from successfully interbreeding with another species. All right, again, it sounds straightforward, but there are many drawbacks. All right, so it might be difficult to determine in nature. Like I said before, maybe they can interbreed with one another, but they choose not to for whatever reason. Right? We can't just put 2 different organisms together and force them to breed. All right, that's not going to work. So just by observationally observing nature, it can be hard to tell. It does not apply to asexual species. Right? Asexual species, you don't need a partner to reproduce. Right? You're basically reproducing on your own. So in that instance, we can't apply the same logic to asexual species. And we can't apply these to extinct species. Right? We can look at fossils of extinct species or maybe historical records, but it's hard to tell who breeded with who, right? Fossils are not as descriptive as what we could go outside and look at right now. So when we look at reproductive isolation, a lot of the time this is commonly used with plants and some animals that reproduce sexually. All right, so if I look at these two plants at the bottom, I might say that they are isolated enough that they can no longer reproduce with each other, so they are different species, even though they might look very similar. We can also use molecular features, and this is becoming more and more prominent today, is being able to look at the molecular genomes of a bunch of different organisms. All right, so when we're looking at molecular features, we're comparing the genomes among different populations of organisms. And we can look at the DNA sequences within a genes. We can look at the gene order along a chromosome structure, even the number of chromosomes. Right? We can look at a lot of differences between these populations. This is very commonly done with smaller organisms, like I put an example of algae up to the side here. All right, so one of the professors I worked with at my graduate university studied algae, and he tried to identify species based on their molecular features. All right, so they look very similar, these two different strains of algae, but they are different species based on their molecular features. The drawback with this one is that sometimes it can be difficult to draw that line. All right, how much of a difference do you need to say it's a different species? All right, if they're differing by 2%, is that enough for them to be a different species? What if they differ by 0.5%? Is that enough? All right, it's hard to draw that line sometimes. And finally, we can look at ecological factors. All right, so this might be any type of factor relating to an organism's habitat that we can use to distinguish different species apart from one another. So for example, those warbler birds up there, they are identified based on what habitat they use to forage for food. So some of them might forage for food on the ground. Some of them might fly up in the trees and forage for food there. Right? So depending on where they're getting their food is kind of determining how we're seeing them as different species. All right, now this can have a drawback, especially when we're talking about species that have a lot of variation to them. Right? Bacteria are a good example of this. Bacteria has a lot of variation. It can look the same if it's grown in the same conditions. It can look the same if it's grown in different conditions. Right? So sometimes it's just hard to distinguish, is it different because of an ecological factor or is it not? Is it just showing that variation? All right, so as a group, I want you to go through those traits that we just looked at. Think of those advantages and why they might be, there might be disadvantages to each of these. And I'll give you some time to do so.
I have a question.
Yeah.
On a meal, if this is online, should we just ignore that, or?
Yeah, I have some students that have it online.
Oh, okay, I just saw that now, and I was like, do we have to take another?
No, if you had clicked on it, it's password protected, so you physically cannot take it.
Okay.
I could not find a way to actually hide it from everybody.
Okay, I was so confused, and I was like,
Yeah.
So, like, reproductive isolation, a lot of things produce asexually, we can't really tell that takes these species.
I also have a question for
Can't really draw the line.
Yeah. So don't you know this about what could have happened to me?
make it happen, make that happen, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
yes.
I don't like this. It's so ambiguous. Really.
That's how I felt about
It's like, what the heck? I really like this is when I start getting actually interested because I know stuff about it just because I look things up and I think they come up. It's like actually things you want to see. But then it's not things you want to see. It's that.
Yeah, it's kind of ambiguous. It's totally like dependent.
Yeah.
One thing does not follow the rule.
That's the only way to really
Alright, so what if I have algae that differs from another algae by 0.1%?
It depends on species. No, well, okay, this is very funny. I think it depends. Like, if that 0.1% means that the only little slight difference that's like that it can kill you, that little percentage, like, has a little bit more cyanide present or something, then yeah, it should be different.
Okay.
But if it's like something stupid, like the shape of it is a little bit like round, why does that even matter?
Alright, so like a functional.
Yeah. It's like that's, again, it's so vague to be like there's a little bit of a difference. Like what kind of a difference?
No.
Is there an actual answer to that, or you just asked?
No.
Okay.
I think you defined it pretty well. I'm just gonna look at it and then try to discover is it important
Yeah.
or not.
There's so many like when you look at actual species, like so many different people who have studied it and claim that it's like a, the subspecies. They're like, no, it's not. Like they can't even figure it out.
That is a huge debate in taxonomists. Taxonomists.
That's a good word.
Oh, that just reminds me.
Alright, so I'm assuming we've had time to think about our question. Alright, so what might be the advantage of looking at just morphological traits?
Easy to tell.
Yeah, easy to tell. I can just look at something and see differences. Alright, but what might be the disadvantage of that?
Wait, yeah. Oh, okay.
We're on the wrong right track. Yeah, you might not be able to tell. Alright, look at those poison dart frogs. Alright, they look very dissimilar, but they were the same species. Alright, so that's definitely a disadvantage. What's another disadvantage? Very talkative group today. Another disadvantage of the morphological features. If I just looked at coloration, could that be enough to tell a frog apart from each other? No. No? Maybe? Alright, maybe I have to add in another trait to it. Alright, so we might have to look at multiple traits, and where do we say 3 traits difference is enough to call a different species? What about reproductive isolation? What's the advantage of that? Is it something we can physically observe with our eyes?
No. Oh, just kidding, maybe.
Maybe, yes. So it might be easy to distinguish, just like those morphological traits, right? But the disadvantage is that sometimes we don't see this happening, right? Maybe they actually could breed with one another, but they don't, right? We don't really know. What about those molecular features? What's the advantage of that? All right, if I'm using a molecular feature to identify different species, what am I looking at? Genes, molecular level structures in terms of like DNA and chromosome number, right? So what might be the disadvantage of that? Yeah, how much of a difference is enough? Did you have something to add to that?
Aren't we like 94% like the same DNA as bananas?
I have heard a statistic similar to that before. It would not surprise me. Yeah, so.
So I feel like that definitely could be a disadvantage there. Like I don't really define with a banana personally.
I know, so 6% difference. It seems between a human and a banana, 6% difference is enough to say, yeah, we're a different species.
60%.
right, so what about ecological factors? What makes a species different based on ecological factors?
Like how they feed, like birds.
Yeah, it could be feeding strategies. Maybe it's nesting strategies. All right, where they're actually inhabiting, the space that they are taking up in the environment. All right, what might be a disadvantage of that?
Like everything.
It could be vague, right? So maybe they might be different species, but they could still look the same, even if they're inhabiting different areas. All right, there's a lot of variation within a species. All right, so these are kind of the quick, easy question or the answers that I put up there, and I will share this slide with you on your student version after class here. All right, so we kind of looked at how do we define a species. All right, so based on all of those traits, biologists have come up with some common ways that they like to describe species. All right, so these are the species concepts. One of the big ones is the biological species concept. So this one is really focusing on reproduction. All right, so if a group of individuals have the potential to interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring, right, they're the same species. Right, that's a biological species concept, really looking at reproduction. They can't interbreed with other species, they are a different species from that. Another type of species concept is this evolutionary lineage concept. Right? So species are defined based on separate evolution of lineages. All right, so this is where we start looking at a phylogeny. And I will most likely post the lecture for phylogenies up this weekend. And you'll understand a little bit more how to read this here. But essentially a lineage is a series of species that forms a line of descent, which each new species is a direct result of speciation from an immediate ancestral species. All right, so that's a pretty complicated way of saying, if I look at this part of the graph here, everything beyond that is related. All right, so that's the evolutionary lineage concept of trying to relate species. Right, who's their ancestor? We can also look at the ecological species concept. All right, so this is where we're looking at species that occupy different ecological niches. All right, so a niche is a unique set of habitat resources that a species requires, as well as its influence on that environment. So this flamingo is in deeper waters here. Right? This is its primary habitat. Right? It's influencing the environment in these deeper water areas versus these plovers. All right? They're not feeding in the waters. They're not really going in the water. They have a different ecological niche. Their niche might be more of on land, in the beach, while these flamingos are in these, I want to say that's probably like a 2-foot water. All right? 2 feet of water. That's their ecological niche. And then finally we have this broad one, this general lineage concept. This kind of incorporates all the other concepts together. Each species of a population is an independently evolving lineage, and multiple criteria are used to determine if the population is a different species. All right, now we only talked about a few of them. I put this image up here to show you that there's a lot of different species concepts out there. And we're looking at different biological evidence to try to prove each species concept. All right, so this general lineage concept is kind of a mesh of all the concepts together. All right, so if you discovered what you believed to be a new species of insect, what species concept would you want to help confirm your hypothesis? All right, there's no right or wrong answers. I just want you to brainstorm. Which one makes sense to you? share. There's no wrong answers here. All right, so who would use the biological species concept, looking at how they reproduce? Show of hands. Okay, a few of you. What about the evolutionary lineage concept? A few more of you. All right, all right. And what about the ecological species concept? All right, looking at different niches. All right, and finally, what about our last concept, which slipped my mind, the general lineage concept? All right, so there's no right answer, right? It could be a variety of them. Maybe we're using primarily one. Maybe we're meshing them all together and using something more like this general lineage concept, all right? Because the general lineage concept tends to include all the other concepts kind of together, this one tends to be a little bit more popular, but it totally depends on what species you're looking at, what organism you're looking at. All right, so a lot of these species concepts will focus on reproductive isolation, especially the biological species concept. All right, so again, we're reproductively isolating these organisms. They're mechanisms that will prevent interbreeding between species. And if we're preventing interbreeding between species, right, that's going to influence the genetic makeup of these populations. All right, so if we're looking at reproductive isolation, we can define it in two different ways. All right, so one is the pre-zygotic isolating mechanism, and the other is the post-zygotic isolating mechanism. All right, so remember, egg and sperm, they will come together to form a zygote. Right? If there's something inhibiting the egg and the sperm from coming together in the first place, that would be a pre-zygotic isolating mechanism. Right? We can't even form the zygote. Right? But if the zygote is able to be formed, right, then something down the line will prevent that zygote from becoming viable. Right? Now, if that zygote ends up being viable and grows up into an organism and produces fertile offspring, right, there's been no reproductive isolation. It can work. All right, so let's go through the pre-zygotic isolating mechanisms. And I think these are pretty straightforward and easy to think about. So one way is habitat isolation. Right, you're geologically isolated from one another. Right, maybe you can't cross a mountain range. Maybe you can't cross the stream. Right, there's some geographic isolation preventing you from even getting to the other population. All right, the other one to think about is a temporal isolation. So the time of year you mate or the time of day that you mate might differ. All right, so when one organism is ready to mate, the other organism is not. Right, and that way they're temporarily isolated. All right, a good example of this is the field crickets. All right, the spring field cricket is ready to mate in the spring, and the fall field cricket is ready to mate in the fall. They might occupy the same area, right, but their mating times is vastly different. All right, we might also have behavioral isolation. Right, so behaviors are an important part in mate choice. All right, so that's sexual selection. Mechanical isolation. All right, two genitalia just do not match. All right, it just doesn't work. All right, so size or incompatible genitalia prevent mating. And then gametic isolation. All right, the gametes just will not unite successfully. Something is preventing that sperm from uniting with the egg. All right, so if I have this species of bird, all right, it's two species of meadowlarks, and they became two different species because they developed two different songs. Right? What type of barrier does this represent? Communication, which might be, thought I heard it mumbled over here. Right, if I looked at these three, and I looked at a lack of communication, what type of barrier might that be? Behavioral, yes. So behavioral, they have two different songs, right? They have evolved two different species based on what song they found was attractive. All right, so if we successfully have an egg and a sperm coming together, right, there's still barriers that they need to overcome. So the post-zygotic isolating mechanisms are that we've actually formed a zygote, all right? But somewhere down the line, that zygote just not going to develop, or the offspring is not going to be fertile. All right, this is typically less common because at this point you've put a lot of energy and time and resources into creating that zygote. Right? So you want to stop, if you're incompatible with each other, stop with the input of energy and resources before you even fuse together. All right? Now once a zygote is formed, we can have hybrid inviability. All right? So the fertilized egg just cannot get past being a fertilized embryo. Right? It might develop a little bit, but it just cannot mature into a full individual. Also, hybrid sterility. All right, so maybe you've seen a mule before. All right, this is a classic example where the zygote can actually develop into a viable offspring. All right, a male donkey and a female horse mate together, create a mule. That mule grows up. It's an organism, right? But that organism does not produce fertile offspring. It is sterile. All right, so we can't go any further than that mule's lineage. We also have hybrid breakdown. All right, so maybe we've created a zygote. Maybe it is viable. All right, it lives past being an embryo. Maybe it produces fertile offspring. All right, but somewhere down the line in that lineage, that offspring is going to start to have genetic abnormalities because of two species interbreeding with one another. All right, so those are all the post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. All right, so I want you to kind of go through and review this yourself, right, looking at our dragonfly species example. Feel free to talk with one another. Get up and do some jumping jacks if you need to. We're really sluggish today. It is a Friday.
I'm trying to figure out if I'm losing my scholarship, but I'm sure I have my tuition. I'm a tad crazy again. Am I gonna pass this class? Like, bro, it's like an A minus plus.
Could not tell you specifics.
Stop. If you pass it,
I do not have that off the top of my head.
What?
I do not know the specific grade off the top of my head.
Like that response.
over here.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to cut this question short and attempt to try to get through the rest of the lecture in 5 minutes. All right, so if we have dragonflies that have a specialized genital structures to prevent them from mating with one another, what type of reproductive isolation is this? Mechanical, yes, mechanical isolation. Is this a pre or post-zygotic isolation? Pre, yes, we don't even get a zygote. Does this mean that the two species will not or cannot mate with one another? They cannot. They are physically incompatible. All right, so the biological species concept, is that problematic? Yeah, it definitely is. All right, disadvantages that we have previously talked about, and it can only be applied to populations that can overlap geographically, but sometimes we have these exceptions that come through. All right, so I actually linked a video which I had intended on showing, but we don't have enough time. I encourage you to watch it. But a grizzly bear and a polar bear, they can actually mate and produce viable, fertile offspring. Right? It's this weird exception of getting this hybrid growler bear. Yeah.
Is a mule interspecies hybrid?
It is a hybrid, and it does come from two species. Yes, but it's not fertile, so it can't go any further.
So it has hybrid sterility.
Yes, there you go. All right, so there's different mechanisms of speciation. All right, speciation that can be caused by genetic changes in a particular group that make it two species different. All right, so there's two possible explanations for why there are different types of species. It might be due to an abrupt event that causes reproductive isolation. And in this case, the abrupt event I'm talking about might be something like non-disjunction, where all of a sudden we have different numbers of chromosomes in some of our species that make them incompatible with others. All right, a more common one is speciation as a consequence of adaptation to a different ecological niche. All right, so this is one where we can think about a river slowly formed, all right, or maybe a volcano erupted and isolated two populations apart, and those two populations over time adapted to different ecological niches. All right, I'm actually going to stop here because we cannot get through the rest of this. All right, we're going to finish this on Monday. I am still going to post that phylogenies lecture, and I still want you to watch that over the weekend. I don't think that lecture is going to take any more than 10 minutes to watch. All right, so on that note, have a good weekend. Try to get some good rest. We're almost to the finish line.
Will not be happening.